All right, in this video, I'm going to review Mill's hedonistic theory of the good life. So his answer to the question of what constitutes the good life and what is necessary for human flourishing. All right, so here we're doing value theory. We're thinking about the nature of the good life. And for the purposes of this video, we could ask that question two separate ways. We could ask, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for well-being? And what are the intrinsic goods of life? We'll look at Mill's answer to these two questions, and then consider the relationship between his two answers. So a necessary condition is something which must occur for an additional thing to occur. So it's a necessary condition that it's below freezing for it to snow. But it's not a sufficient condition because other things must be true in order for it to snow. For example, there has to be precipitation overhead in order for it to snow, so it doesn't suffice. Therefore, a sufficient condition is something which immediately brings about some additional thing. So we can ask, what are the necessary conditions for well-being? Are there a set of things that we need to achieve in order to be well off? Or are there sufficient things? If there are sufficient things, then once we get one of them, we'll have well-being. But if there are multiple necessary conditions for well-being, then not one will suffice. All right, next we have this distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value. When we value something instrumentally, we value it for what it gets us and not for its own sake. So it seems like we value, for example, medicine instrumentally because we care about medicine as a result of it getting us health and well-being or lack of pain. If medicine never got us those things, we wouldn't care about it in itself. So we only care about it instrumentally. We care about it as a means to a particular end that we have. But when we value something intrinsically, we value it for its own sake and not just for what it gets us. As we'll see, Mill argues that pleasure is intrinsically valuable, which is to say, we care about it for its own sake. We don't care about it for what it gets us, so we don't care about it instrumentally. So there's an important relationship, I think, between these two distinctions. So if a good is intrinsically valuable, if an aspect of life is intrinsically valuable, like pleasure, then we value it for its own sake and not for what it gets us. And if we value something for its own sake, then it seems plausible to suggest that it's a necessary condition for well-being. So those things which matter in and of themselves seem very important to us, and so therefore are probably necessary for our well-being. And then we can ask, well, are the intrinsic goods also sufficient? If they're sufficient, then once we get a hold of one of them, we'll have well-being. So supposing Mill thinks pleasure is necessary for well-being, we could also ask, does he think it's sufficient? Because if he thinks it's sufficient, then he'll think, we have to have pleasure in order to have well-being, and once we do get it, we will be well off because it also suffices for well-being. All right, so Mill's hedonism. So Mill was a major defender of the ethical theory called utilitarianism, and utilitarianism has as its major ethical principle the greatest happiness principle, which says the right course of action is the one that maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain for the greatest number of persons, all counting equally. So here you can see Mill integrating a particular value into his consequentialist thought. He says, when you act, you should consider the consequences of your actions, and you should evaluate the consequences of your actions in terms of pleasure and pain. That's how we evaluate them. That's the metric by which we consider each possible consequence. So Mill thinks pleasure is equivalent to happiness, and pain is equivalent to unhappiness. So Mill thinks pleasure plays a crucial role in evaluating the ethics of our actions, since ultimately happiness will be related to the rightness or wrongness of our actions. So his position about the rightness or wrongness of actions in ethics is based on his position within value theory. It's based on his view of what makes life good. It's based on his view of what he thinks is ultimately or fundamentally valuable. So if the general question we're asking in value theory is what makes life good, then Mill's answer is pleasure. So Mill is a hedonist. So we need to define hedonism. Hedonism as a position within value theory is the view that pleasure is the crucial source of well-being and human flourishing. So we, of course, will then need definitions of pleasure. All right, so here's Mill's crucial hedonic statement. This is where he establishes his idea that pleasure is the most fundamental or important good. He says, pleasure and freedom from pain are the only thing desirable as ends. So here we have that language of ends again. He's saying pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, which is to say they appear to be intrinsically valuable for their own sake and not what they get us. So he's not saying pleasure and freedom from pain are valuable as means to ends. He's saying they're ends in themselves. They're worth achieving for their own sake. And so it follows that all desirable things, which are as numerous, he says, in the utilitarian as in any other scheme, are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. So everything else we care about because they are pleasurable or they're a path to pleasure. So everything else we care about is instrumentally valuable for bringing about pleasure for us. And so they're instrumentally valuable for bringing about the most fundamental or intrinsic good that there is, namely pleasure. So if I said to you, well, why are you getting a college degree? You might say, well, I'm getting a college degree because I want an education. And I might ask you, well, why do you want an education? Well, you might say, well, I want a career. And I might ask you, well, why do you want a career? And you might say, well, I want money. And if I ask you why you want money, you might say, I want freedom, or I want pleasure. As we explain our valuing and we get to values like pleasure, Mill thinks are explaining ends. We've come to the end of explanation. There's nothing more fundamental to point to than pleasure itself. So that makes pleasure fundamentally valuable as an end in itself, independent of what it gets us. So therefore, pleasure is not a means to an end. So how does this map onto our two distinctions? For Mill, pleasure is the only intrinsic good, right? So he's not saying pleasure is one intrinsic good among the many, which is a separate view. It follows that since pleasure is the only intrinsic good, everything else we care about, we do so instrumentally as a means to bringing about pleasure. So your college education, your career, those things are instrumentally valuable, and they're instrumentally valuable for bringing about pleasure for you. They bring about, or they are a means for bringing about, the most basic or fundamental good, namely pleasure. And since pleasure is the only intrinsic good, it is necessary for well-being. So, since Mill has established the great importance of pleasure, if pleasure is the most important thing possible, it seems to follow that it's going to be necessary for well-being. In other words, if pleasure is the most intrinsic good, and if we're wondering what we need in order to be well off, it seems like pleasure is the ultimate candidate, since it's the most important thing. So therefore, pleasure would be necessary for well-being. But since it's the only intrinsic good, you can say it's sufficient for well-being, right? So it's jointly necessary and sufficient. It's necessary because you have to have it in order to be well off. But since it's the only intrinsic good, it also suffices for well-being. Thus the phrase, pleasure is jointly necessary and sufficient for well-being. All right, now there is a concern about this, this conception of the good life, which I'm dubbing here the beast objection. So Mill, in his text, Utilitarianism, spends a lot of time imagining how people might disagree with his position. So he raises a number of important objections to his view. And this is just a general philosophical strategy of thinking about how one person might disagree with your view so you can try to answer those objections. And by answering those objections, you can strengthen your position. That's what Mill's up to here. So here's a quote where he articulates what I'm calling the beast objection. He says, "Now, such a theory of life excites in many minds, and among them, in some of the most estimable in feeling and purpose, inveterate dislike. To suppose that life has, as they express it, no higher end than pleasure, no better and nobler pursuit, they designate as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine." All right, so maybe pause the video before you move forward and reflect. Why might someone view Mill's position this way? Why might they view the claim that pleasure is the only intrinsic good as utterly mean and groveling, as a doctrine worthy only of swine? What's that worry about? Let me take a minute and think about that. Here, I think the objection bottoms out in a worry about what pleasure is. Some of us might think that pleasure is merely physical. And if pleasure is merely physical, then it might be just that which we have in common with the lower animals. Because we derive a lot of pleasure from our physical aspects. So we derive pleasure from eating, sleeping, recreation, sexual activity. These are physical pleasures. But these are physical pleasures we have in common with swine or other lower animals. So if Mill's claim is that pleasure is all we need for well-being, and if pleasure is just that which we share with the lower animals, then his claim will ultimately be the pleasure of the lower animals is all we need in order to be well off. And that seems to be a false account of human well-being, and it seems to be a false account of human well-being because it seems like we just need more than physical pleasure in order to be well off. So that's the objection. Here's Mill's reply. He comes up with a response by drawing a distinction between kinds of pleasures. So he says, the comparison of the Epicurean life, and here you can just mean the hedonistic life, to that of beasts is felt as especially degrading, precisely because a beast's pleasures do not satisfy a human being's conception of happiness. So here he's going to say that the pleasure of the human and the pleasure of the swine are different, such that you can't claim that all pleasure entails is physical pleasure. So he says there's no known Epicurean, and again you could take that to be hedonistic, theory of life which does not assign to the pleasures of the intellect, of the feeling and imagination, and of the moral sentiments a much higher value as pleasure than those of mere sensation. Okay, so here Mill is saying human beings have higher and lower faculties. Our lower faculties are those faculties we share with the lower animals. These are our physical aspects. So in fact, it is true that we might have in common with the lower animals the pleasures derived from our physical bodies. But, he says, we also have higher faculties. And these higher faculties, things like imagination, feeling, pleasure of the intellect, and of the moral sentiments, are also things that we get pleasure from. And they are lacking in the lower animals. So when he says pleasure is necessary for well-being, what he means is that it's a full range of pleasure. It's those pleasures derived from the lower faculties and the pleasures derived from the higher faculties. Since the lower animal doesn't have the higher faculties, Mill's conception of pleasure won't be equivalent to the pleasure of the lower animals or the swine. So when he says pleasure is necessary for well-being, he means to include those pleasures derived from the exercise of our higher faculties. So we get pleasure out of imagining the future and reflecting on the past, thinking about right and wrong, engaging in debate, using our intellect. These are all pleasurable activities, and they're not shared with the lower animals. Therefore, the pleasure of the lower animal is not the pleasure of the human being. And so Mill's claim that pleasure is necessary and sufficient for well-being is not the claim that the pleasure of the lower animals is necessary and sufficient for well-being. So that's how Mill avoids the beast objection.